Traders, how are you? Marcello, founder of the Day Trading Academy. Today we're doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week. Overall, we had a lot of, let's say, bad economic news that affected the market. For the most part, that's really what affected the market overall. At the beginning of the week, the weaker economic data from the US and Europe weighed on global stocks quite a bit, and that essentially sent a lot of investors to safe havens, silver, gold, the dollar, and it pushed the American dollar up to a 29-month high. U.S. indices, the Dow went down 0.93%, the S&P 500 went down 0.34%, and the NASDAQ is 0.53 positive. Overseas market news, the biggest loser was 3.79% loss for the London FTSE. All others are mostly negative as well. In Latin American and Canadian markets, they were mixed for the most part. The biggest loser was 2.46%. A big loss, well, not big loss, but a relatively big loss for the Brazilian Bovespa, and the Argentina Merval was the biggest winner at 10.18%. Africa and Middle Eastern markets are mixed as well. Nigeria was the biggest loser at 2.55%. Remember that Nigeria is the biggest economy in Africa. Egypt is positive 2.61%. Asia and Australian markets are mostly lower. The Sensex in India went down by 3.05%. And for all of our traders in the Philippines, the Filipino stock exchange went down by 1.48%. In Bitcoin news and cryptocurrencies, U.S. billionaire investor Mark Cuban, which is the Mavs owner, the basketball team in Texas, says that cryptocurrencies, particularly Bitcoin, are only, quote, worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. He remains skeptical towards the mainstream adoption of Bitcoin. And also the big news about the Libra, which was Facebook's cryptocurrency, their payment coalition now is on rocky terrain. PayPal just withdrew from the project, so they're not going to be part of the project anymore. And now Visa and MasterCard, which are other key partners, financial partners, are reconsidering of getting themselves out of the project. Obviously, this is because of the regulatory scrutiny. You guys remember last week, even the German finance minister said that it should be outlawed. So, as I mentioned to you guys before, this is why I like to record these videos so you guys can learn this as well. It's important to realize that, is Bitcoin still going to exist? Probably. It'll go up and down. You can probably buy and sell. But I don't think the government, as I've said multiple times, is going to allow somebody else to take away their financial authority away from them. Okay? In financial and banking news, interest rate futures traders on Thursday are increasing their bets that the Fed, the central bank in the United States, is going to lower its interest rates for a third time this year, later this month. PMI survey showed, PMI is a manufacturing index. It showed that the growth in U.S. services sectors appears to be stagnating to a 3-year low. And following Tuesday's ISM's manufacturing index, showing activity on that index that it's the weakest in a decade. In commodities, U.S. crude went down by 5.87% at $52.81. International crude, which is called Brent, went down 5.94% to about $58.44. Brent futures are down 8.7% since the end of June. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, hope I said that right, warns that a war with his country and Iran would be a total collapse of the global economy and should be avoided. And the 14-member nation of OPEC cartel saw an output fall of 8-year low in September with just under 30 million barrels a day. Remember that the infrastructure in Saudi Arabia was attacked with a drone, supposedly by Iran, and also we had a deepening impact of the supply glut with the sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. Swiss banking giant UBS is raising its forecast for gold for the second time in less than 2 months. It's predicting that it's going to arrive to $1,730 a troy ounce in 2020. Up $50 from an August forecast. That's about 15%, just over 15%. And the most recent price is about $1,500. This week went up 0.54%, 1,505. Silver's up 0.06% at $17.61. In political news, Peru's armed forces and political reaffirmed allegiance. Let me rephrase that. Peru armed forces and the police reaffirmed their allegiance for the president Martin Vizcarra late on Monday as he moved to close Congress, and many dismissed lawmakers pledged loyalty to the vice president. Worst crisis in Peru in years. And in Hong Kong, they continue to be in a bit of a flux as the prime minister, the leader there in Hong Kong, her name is Carrie Lam, invoked colonial-era emergency powers after 18 weeks now it's been since the protest actually started. These powers have last used in over 50 years ago, and it moves further. Obviously, it didn't help the situation with the protesters, right? It made it worse. It allows for curfews, censorship of the media, control of harbors, ports, and transport. And also, Lam hasn't specified any action as of now beyond the ban on the masks that the protesters were using. In economic news, UN manufacturing activity tumbled more than a 10-year low in September. Lingering U.S.-China trade tensions are weighed on exports, obviously, after heightened financial market concerns. Sharp slowdown in economic growth in quarter three. That's what a lot of this information showed. The ISM index, which is another manufacturing index, has declined for the sixth consecutive month, September being the second straight month, and the index broke below the 50 thresholds, which means an actual contraction. The Eurozone manufacturing data for August, the whole economic bloc of the EU, contracted to its steepest rate in the last 7 years, in almost 7 years. And the U.S. economy added 136 jobs in December, just under the forecast of 145,000. Labor participation rate is at 63.2%. Unemployment rate dropped to 3.5 from 3.7. It's a 50-year low, and wages are up to 2.9% year over year. In corporate news, WeWork withdrew its IPO after firing their CEO, Adam Neumann. Really funny story. I just read on the news, actually, that banks lended this guy $500 million because they thought it was guaranteed to be paid back by the company. It puts a lot of pressure on WeWork to secure alternative financing due to the fact that they borrowed $3 billion. They borrowed $6 billion under the assumption that they were going to go public to be able to raise $3 billion. And they are hemorrhaging money. They're losing at about $700 million quarterly, so almost $1 billion they're losing quarterly. I don't understand how these businesses stay in business. Airbnb is set to hire Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs as joint lead advisors for their stock market flotation in 2020. They're actually going to do what's called a direct listing rather than an IPO. An IPO, an initial public offering, is when they sell new shares. A direct listing is when you just put them on the exchange instead of selling new shares that they already have. Airbnb is leaning towards doing a direct listing. That's why they are using Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. And essentially, there's obviously advantages and disadvantages to both, but they feel that the direct listing is better for them. European top court says the EU can now order Facebook to remove post photographs and videos, as well as restrict global access to that material. It can also compel a tech giant to remove worldwide user comments that have been declared illegal. This is a big sign that greater government control to the internet are coming, FYI. Facing unexpectedly higher demand, Apple told suppliers to boost its production of the iPhone 11 by 10%, up to an 8 million unit increase. It suggests that the new iPhone price structure is paying off with higher shipments. In trade news, Europe, we're now going to start having a trade war, it looks like, between the U.S. and Europe, with Trump's, obviously, the ideology of America first. He's disputing about the aircraft subsidies and auto tariffs that are coming to a head over the next 2 months, which is a possible trade war. Essentially, the World Trade Organization gave the U.S. permission to impose tariffs due to the fact that they found that Europe, the government, helped illegally Airbus, which is the airline, the company that constructs the airplanes, which is the main competition for Boeing, that they gave them $7.5 billion. So this is a retaliation for the illegal government aid to Airbus. The list is going to include hundreds of European products that are going to get new tariffs this month, including 25% levies on French wine, Italian cheeses, etc. UPS is going to win its first full approval to operate a drone airline by the government. It's going to lead a nascent U.S. drone delivery business. Obviously, this is a leg up with a competition between Amazon and also Alphabet, which is the main player is Google. In investment news, GM and the United Automotive Workers Union continue to try to make a deal as the strike is moving towards its third week. UAW represents 48,000 striking hourly workers. So it's big news for a company like GM, which is one of the largest car makers in the world. Adding to international investor worries, Refinity data is saying that European companies are set for the worst quarterly earnings in 3 years as the revenue drops for the first time since early 2018. And Uber is launching a new app in Chicago Friday that's going to match temporary workers with shift work businesses, essentially temp workers, right? What they're trying to do is essentially add to their main product line, which is, Uber cars, where you rent the cars temporarily to go from, taxis essentially, right? But a little higher end. Now that the mainstay business is under threat by California, which is saying that the workers that work for Uber might actually be considered employees, not independent contractors. International events, many demonstrators killed across Iraq this week with violent protests against government corruption escalated on Sunday. This is the worst protest that we've seen in Iraq since they defeated the Islamic State. And also in Ecuador, President Lenin Moreno declared a state of emergency Thursday, due to the fact that we had all kinds of protesters hurling stones and also erecting burning barricades. The government decided to stop a 40-year-old fuel subsidy across the country, which costed the government $1.3 billion annually. And diesel and petrol prices, petrol being gasoline prices, are expected to double for domestic consumers. And in unusual facts this week, Taipei, my heart goes out to all of you guys. They're going to get the typhoon Mitag, which has very, very strong storm winds at about 67 miles an hour. And also there's another, if you guys don't know what a typhoon is, it's essentially a hurricane in Asia. Just think of it that way. And there's another hurricane other than Mitag in Asia. There's a hurricane called Lorenzo, which is the largest storm ever to roam the eastern Atlantic. The forecast is expected to strike the Ireland's west coast, winds of 90 miles an hour, but it's swelled in size. It's about 390 miles from its center. That's probably over 600, 700 kilometers, and it's a record for that part of the Atlantic. And President Obrador in Mexico is pledged on tackling corruption in Mexico, and previous Mexican government lacked the attention as well. There's a situation now where there's organized groups that are latching on to the pipelines, of oil pipelines, and also literally stealing the tankers that transport the oil and the diesel fuel. And they steal about 1.18 million barrels a day, which goes literally billions of dollars to criminal organizations, and it costs the government a loss of $1 billion annually, and it makes it very difficult to control. And Italy presented a scheme on Friday to accelerate the expulsion of migrants who don't have a right to be in the country. It cuts the time to decide on an asylum seeker must return home or not. Immigration is due to the flow of immigration into Europe. A lot of the far-right leaning parties in Europe have gained traction, and the leader Matteo Salvini imposed a crackdown on new arrivals, and as we can now see that Europe is not so welcoming anymore to immigrants. That's the news for this week, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next week.